We are going to learn the perfect and pluperfect passive subjunctive. Those of you who were paying close attention before break might remember that we talked briefly about this, but I wanted to give you a more formal, full, and permanent introduction. You can always come back and look at this video should you forget the rules and get brought right back to speed. All right, so let's dive in. First off, we're going to start with the goals. By the end of this video, you should be able to form the perfect passive perfect and pluperfect subjunctive of all verbs if you were given their principal parts, and if that verb had passive forms to begin with. You should know how to distinguish the passive subjunctive from the passive indicative, and also recognize the relationship between the two forms. And finally, as always, the real end goal is just to be able to say more cool things in Latin, or read them in Latin. Like, for example, I know why Caesar was killed, if you want to, flaunt your knowledge. Or, if only our morals had not been lost, for when lamenting the current state of, society's morals, nothing quite gets the point across like saying it in classical language. Speaking from experience. All right, so moving forward. Recall. Perfect and pluperfect passive indicative. I threw a word up here. Perdo, perdere, perditi, perditum. Anyone remember what it means? Lose. So now you see how we're going to learn how to say that phrase that I mentioned before. Yes, the verb to lose, to waste, to destroy. And let's start by just recalling the indicative forms of this. You can pause the video here right after this brief clue. If you're having trouble remembering these, start by thinking, what principal part am I going to build this form off of? Okay, start with that. But let's pause the video now, take some time to try and fill this in on your own on a sheet of paper, and then I will show you the answers. But this retrieval practice is important, so do that. All right, here they are. A quick reminder that this first form, perdita, comes from that fourth principal part, perditum. And I could make it perditus, I could make it perdita, or I could make it perditum, depending on the gender of the subject. In order to give us a little gender variety and, support, gender equality, I've gone with the female gender for this example. So you have perdita sum, perdita est, I am lost, you are lost, she was lost. Wait, sorry, did I say that right? I was lost. That's a big mistake. I was lost, you were lost, he, she, it was lost. And that mistake is valuable in the sense that it reminds you that these sums can be tricky. You want to translate them as I am, you are, he, she, it is, but because it's part of a larger verb, in English we just happen to translate the perfect passive with a was, not an is, in order to indicate that the action happened in the past. And so that's one of the pitfalls of translating these forms, and also remembering how to form them. So, perditae sumus, perditae estis, perditae sunt. You can remember that. The reason why I changed it to perditae is now the subject is plural. So we're talking about multiple women, so we have to make sure that the perditus matches up. In the pluperfect, we do the same formation rules, except for now, instead of the present tense of sum, we replaced it with the imperfect indicative of sum. And the translation for this would be, I had been lost, you had been lost, she had been lost, so on and so forth. Okay? All right, so now that this is fresh in your mind, logically, just think, which of these things could I change and easily make it look subjunctive as opposed to indicative? Can you change that fourth principal part, or should you change the sum? All right, try and think about that. And if you think of it, see if you can form it in the perfect and pluperfect ahead of time. See how you would take a stab at what you think it's going to look like. All right, if you want a little more time, pause it, because I'm moving on. Here they are. Yeah, it's just a quick switch. If you notice, It was perdita sum and perdita eram. Now it's perdita sim and perdita essem. Why? Because these are the present tense subjunctive forms of sum, which we've already learned, albeit a little while ago. So this is a good refresher. And this is the imperfect subjunctive forms of sum, because look, it's just sum esse fui futuris. That esse is the second principle of art. It means to be by itself. And just like all our imperfect subjunctives, we are just forming them by attaching endings onto the full second principle part. So the only thing we change is we keep the tenses of sum, of the form of sum, the same, but we're just going to move them into the subjunctive. And we've already learned those subjunctive forms of sum. So it's not really so much learning entirely new material. It's putting together other information that we've already learned into and using that to create this form, the perfect and pluperfect passive subjunctive. So naturally now we want to know, how should I translate it? And translation depends on the usage, just like all other subjunctives we've learned so far. There isn't really a set translation. But let's practice with a couple. Why don't you take a couple minutes to practice these, pause the video, and then I will explain the answers. All right, maybe you remember these from before. That first slide, as promised, you now know how to say, I know why Caesar was killed. Scio cur Caesar interfectus sit. Right, we have to make that was killed subjunctive because this is a what usage of the subjunctive? Indirect question, exactly. So in Latin, they thought of that was killed as a subjunctive usage, whereas we kind of translate it in English. We essentially just keep it in the indicative in English. And then in Latin again, we have if only our morals had not, ne, utinam ne, had not been lost. So there you go. When you want to lament the current state of affairs, you have that line now. Use it wisely. And remember again, this is another example where in English we kind of just use the indicative, but in Latin, right, this is a hypothetical. It's not a real statement of fact. This is what we wish had been true. And so in Latin, they think of it as the subjunctive, not as the indicative. And finally, we have this English to Latin to really test you, as the stretch question. Rogavi, I asked. By whom, quo, right? It's personal agent with a relative pronoun. So we put that relative pronoun into the ablative. I was unable to make a macron over that, but there should be. The huge bridge had been defended. Huge bridge is our new subject of the subordinate clause, which can be found introduced by the relative clause. And we need a pluperfect subjunctive here, because again, it's indirect question, and we are in secondary sequence because the introductory verb was a past tense verb, right? Perfect tense, specifically. All right, I hope this is helpful, and I hope you feel good about your perfect passive subjunctive forms now. And I'll see you in class tomorrow.